I also think it's really important for people to feel like they're actually contributing to something and that they see there's room for them to grow and evolve. So it's really up to our industry to provide those kinds of opportunities.
Stephanie Fullerton has worked as a commercial escrow officer and at a title production software vendor. This mix of industry experience over the course of more than a decade revealed the gaps between those working in the industry, those regulating it, and those providing technology solutions. In response, she eventually founded Streamline Consulting to help title companies bridge these gaps, becoming more efficient and reaching their business goals. In my conversation with Stephanie, we discuss how title companies can evaluate solutions for better data management, preventing cyber attacks, training teams to use the software in a way that suits their operations, and driving more awareness of the industry. I'm Amanda Farrell, and this is Title Talks. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me today and to share some of your insight with our podcast audience. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's just first start off by getting into a little bit about your background and what led you to establish your consulting firm.
Oh, yes. It's a fun story. So I do come from the industry. I was a commercial escrow officer for almost 9 years, and it was primarily on the commercial side of the business. I reached a point where the last company that I was with, they actually asked us to migrate over into the residential setting. And it was at the time when the big refi boom was happening. And to be candid, it was not my cup of tea. Completely different from commercial. And I really didn't care too much for what I was seeing. So I decided to kind of dip out of that component of our industry and try something new. And I went to work for one of the software vendors. And when I did it, I loved it. I started off at the very bottom because, of course, I'm not myself like a technical person. I wasn't an IT person by trade or by nature, but I understood software very well. And that seemed to be where I thrived. And so when I went to work for the vendor, I was very transparent and said, listen, I'll have to work my way up, but I've been the go-to person at certain places that I've worked. When it comes to the software, I had kind of established that kind of credibility, and I think I can, be a benefit to the company. And so sure enough, they took a gamble on me, and I worked for them for about 4 years. I started off, as I mentioned, in support. I ended up in training. I did help a little bit with some implementation, some tech writing. And I mean, I really got to see a lot of the other side of things. So, up to that point, obviously I was an end user and seeing what that looked like. And now here I was on the technical side of things. And it became really glaringly obvious that there was somehow kind of a breakdown between the two. And what I came to acknowledge is in our industry, there used to be really two kind of primary resources when it came to technology and or just the industry knowledge. It was your underwriters and the governing entities such as Alta, RESPA, those kinds of things. And then it was the software vendors. But there was really no one in between. And the problem with that was the software vendors are great about knowing their platforms and understanding the functionality of their platforms, but they weren't so great about understanding the industry itself. And when it came to the other side, right, the underwriters and the governing entities definitely understand the industry, but not so much the platform. So when I ended up leaving that software company, I took a pause and I thought, what could I do to be a benefit and draw upon my skill set and knowledge without getting sucked back into doing closings again and title. And so I started reaching out to companies and just kind of asking, if you were to need help, what would that look like? And one thing led to another. And before we knew it, here I was in a consulting role and doing things simple. It started off in the beginning. I was helping type policies. I was helping doing some trainings, configuring some documents. Then it was helping open branches for new companies and things like that. So it really became, in my mind, a need. It was out of necessity that Streamline was born to help bridge that gap between the industry and the technology. I felt like title companies and escrow companies needed an advocate to kind of help guide them through that process and evolve in their own structures and their own organizations, not only technologically, but also with the industry itself and keeping up to date with that.
Data as an asset is arguably one of the most valuable assets that businesses have today, including title companies. Managing that data can be really difficult. So, what are some of the options that are available to title companies today? I hear a lot about cloud computing, and then of course there's the standard, maintaining your own servers. But is there another option? And can you kind of go through what each of those options are and how people can evaluate the best way to manage their data?
Yeah, definitely. So we see a lot of variations. We actually do still, believe it or not, see a lot of people with physical servers. Now, usually there's more of a hybrid situation where they may have a physical server on site or being hosted, at a data center, and then they also have something like a cloud backup or some type of cloud environment involved in some capacity. But physical servers obviously is one, cloud servers being another. And this can be handled in a multitude of ways as well. You can have a cloud server that's managed by someone in-house. You can, have a cloud solution that is managed completely by a third-party company. Or it can be a combination of all of the above. And then we also have the situation where some people opt to maintain IT in-house, whether it's physical servers or cloud servers. And then other companies really prefer just to kind of outsource that and go to a third party altogether. And then again, we have the hybrid situations where it's a combination of both. So we've kind of seen that mixture all the way around with various clients. Of course, a lot of it depends on the size. And always you're having to consider what are the end goals, right? Because if you're a larger company, you would probably want to have a combined effort so that if, God forbid, internally something were to maybe not be as scalable as you need, you've got that resource externally. And then if you're a smaller company, maybe you don't want to have any internal resources. Maybe it's just easier for you to outsource all of your stuff. In fact, for us, for a while, we kind of had both, but now we rely solely on an outsourced third party. And our stuff, it happens to be all in the cloud, although we've recently, due to events in our industry, have been evaluating things very strongly, not only for ourselves, but with our clients for that very reason.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm sure you're referencing the CloudStar ransomware attack. Maybe tell us a little bit more about what the risks and benefits are of using cloud computing and what sort of evaluations to sort of make sure that you're managing all of those potential risks.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it was definitely a learning opportunity, one that certainly I don't think anyone was really fully prepared for. So we were able to obviously identify risks. You're no matter what, you're going to be vulnerable to hacking. So you can have that whether you have a physical server in-house or whether you have something, externally, you're being cloud hosted. There's always that vulnerability. That's just the age that we live in now. But other risks then come into play when you're talking about, especially with like a physical server, are there outages, right? Is there, it can be anything. We had one client that was actually, their building was struck by lightning. It crashed their server. Their whole building was on fire. Like, it was devastating. Now, fortunately, they were one of those hybrid situations where they were immediately able to get back up and running because they also had a cloud solution that was able to get them, back up within, I feel like they said it was really remarkable timing, like within 24 hours or something like that. So risks of cloud hosting is vulnerability and then outages beyond your control. You just don't have that kind of control. Benefits, though, are things like avoiding physical damage, right? So due to a flood or a fire or a lightning strike in this case. If it's a managed solution, not having to maintain it yourself, right? Because there's always that element. Anytime you involve equipment, there's a maintenance situation that's eventually going to occur. You're either going to have to upgrade equipment, you're going to have to maybe buy new equipment. That's always a concern. And then depending on the company who is hosting your equipment, there may be added security or not. So it's kind of a, you really have to look at, again, what are the end goals? What are you shooting for? Because in most cases, when people turn their data over to a cloud environment or a hosting company that they're entrusting with their data, they're assuming blindly that everything is going to be taken care of. And we just can't do that anymore. We have to really be looking at all aspects of the situation and all pieces of the puzzle. So we actually now are recommending multiple backups for clients. We're recommending multiple solutions. Some of our clients, this scared them so bad that they want to go back to servers, and we're saying, well, let's just pause for a minute, because you're still opening yourself up to additional risks and things like that. It's still going to have to be managed. It's still going to have to be secured. But there's nothing wrong with having multiple solutions in place, even if that does mean a physical component. So, for example, if let's say you did have, your primary server is hosted by a third party, you could have redundancy that's also in a cloud environment that maybe is a different company and or different hosting solution. And then you could even have a third, which would be a physical component, such as, removable drives or something of that nature. So we're really taking a look at what are the best options for something of this nature, and just in general for a disaster recovery plan.
Yeah, I think redundancy is definitely a really important point when it comes to evaluating these third-party data solution providers or IT support. Do you have any other advice that you would give to title professionals when they are considering outsourcing some of these services?
Yeah, first and foremost, vet this company, vet them well. Make sure even if you don't know the questions to ask, find someone who does know the questions to ask, because there are a lot of components, and I'm not IT. I'm not even pretending to be IT, which is why I hire an IT company to make sure that we're safe, to make sure that, we're operating properly. So vetting the IT support provider is critical. Don't just go based on someone's word. Do the research. And again, if you don't know what that entails, then get help with that. And one of the resources I think you could look to would be your underwriters, right? They have baseline recommendations that you can kind of start to use as a guideline. Some things to be looking into are find out what types of security they use themselves. Find out what types of security they're going to use to protect you. And are you on a shared network? Are you sharing with other companies? Or are you an isolated incident where you're on a server by yourself? These are things that you definitely want to look into. You want to ascertain if they're familiar with and proficient in supporting the levels of security needed, because there are different levels of security needed. You want to determine what levels of liability they're willing to incur. Like, do they have insurance? What are the insurances and assurances that they're going to be able to give you for protecting your data? And then at the end of the day, you just have to weigh out the costs associated and make a determination as to what's going to be the best solution for you. The other thing is, I never, ever stick with just one. I always, if you're going to be evaluating companies, I usually look at least 3 to 5. I also always ask for recommendations and referrals. Get as many referral sources or references that you possibly can, and call them all and find out what is their day-to-day experience like? What is their annual experience like? What kinds of questions did they ask about security? There's nothing wrong with being transparent and saying, gosh, I just am curious, what did you ask for when you went to use them? What was important to you? Maybe there's some things that that I don't know. And I one thing through this event that I found that I was most impressed with in our industry is the collaborative efforts of helping one another. I will tell you, we had a lot of clients that really just were immediately stand up, whatever they could do to help the other clients. They didn't know these clients. They just were ready and willing to help each other. And there were a lot of calls between multiple clients, just information gathering, sharing information. And there's no reason that you can't do that when you're looking for a new service provider. It doesn't matter what they're in. If it's for security, if it's for hosting, it doesn't really matter. There is no reason you can't be transparent and ask these other companies, what did you do? What was important for you?
Yeah, so I did want to ask a little bit about, maybe your personal opinion on it sounds like you have to prepare yourself a lot when you even just start. You know, you have to do research in order to know which questions to ask. So, in your personal opinion, do you think title companies today would benefit from having an in-house IT person to rely on, or do you think that outsourcing this kind of stuff makes sense still?
Boy, that's such a it truly does depend on the client and their needs, because on the one hand, depending on the structure and the setup of the environment, it can be very beneficial to have someone in-house. On the other hand, it's not always necessary. It goes back to, what are the end goals? But I do think this, whether you have someone in-house or whether you outsource, you need to make sure that you at least have another resource that you can run things by. I just don't ever like to put all my eggs in one basket. I just don't. I like to have multiple resources. And then at the end of the day, I have the information that I need to make a final decision. Now, typically, if you do have someone in-house, especially the larger companies where they've got like a CIO, a CTO, and then they have teams of, support people underneath them, in that case, you would hope that you've hired the guidance and the expertise that you need. You would. But there's still nothing wrong with having someone else to run stuff by. And I would be surprised if they themselves didn't have that for their own decision-making purposes, the CTO, the CIO. I mean, they do have resources that go beyond just their immediate surroundings. So yeah, it's one of those things that it really depends on the client itself, the company itself, what the end goals are, what kind of resources and scalability they have.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too about how even IT experts have a community in which they use each other as sounding boards to find solutions. I know in IT, a lot of them have online communities, message boards where they work through problems together. So I know in the title industry, there is an Alta message board that maybe people can use to just ask general questions about how other companies sort of solve these problems when it comes to IT or data management or whatever it might be. And then, of course, maybe even turning to LinkedIn and the groups that you're a part of too. Maybe that's a good place to start as well, just figuring out what questions to ask, what other sort of processes people who've gone through it have followed. So maybe that's some place to start as well.
Absolutely.
So cybersecurity is only one part of the problem facing data management, obviously. There's also natural disasters to think about. You mentioned someone's server being struck by lightning. And I know that a lot of people in the industry still rely on paper documentation. Flooding is a huge issue in a lot of states in the United States. It's getting worse in some areas. So what does a holistic approach to safeguarding data look like?
Well, that's one of the things that we ourselves are working through with clients right now. Redundancy is key. I cannot stress that enough. You've got to have redundancy in place, whether it's physical or in a virtual setting. Redundancy is key. Now, no matter what, you should always have redundancy in a virtual setting. And yet there is still somewhat of a need, at least in part, for physical documentation in certain aspects. So making sure you have proper backups, whether that's in the cloud or physical or both. Okay. So backups of your server, backups of your data. And again, it could be a mixed solution. And then some things that we're recommending after seeing these kinds of events are doing things such as exports from databases. So, for example, we support four of the major production platforms, and there are ways to export data so that not only would you have the entire database intact, if God forbid all of your fail safes, failed. You would still have these exports where if you had to start over with a seed database, you would have some data and documentation to be able to import or upload. You'd have kind of snapshots, if you will, which is why we're recommending like a completely third solution, really, not just the instance of your primary server and a backup server, but like a third solution. And in some cases, some people have actually stated, well, we want some of these exports to be documented on paper. Not a bad idea, especially things like when it comes to workflows or things that can easily be transferred into some type of written or printed documentation fairly easily. We're not talking manuals and manuals of information here. The other thing is documents. One of the things that we found people scrambling around for were just their basic documents. So even having just one or two files of, these are our standard refi documents, these are our standard purchase sale loan documents, something of that nature. And again, I'm not advocating a lot of paper. At the same time, if we're going to be looking at things, as you mentioned, holistically, we kind of need to take some of these things into consideration. So having those somewhere in a fireproof and or waterproof safe is not a bad idea for a backup situation. Running reports is also something that I think is really critical. And I don't feel like we see that enough. People get so caught up in the day-to-day happenings, and especially over the last couple of years where everyone is just inundated with work, that we're really not always taking the time to run reports on data. And I think that can actually help quite a bit. Just having, again, these kind of snapshots to see where things are. At least you'd have things like file numbers and maybe buyers' names, sellers' names, something of that nature. Nothing NPI related, of course, would we ever recommend that you save and store. But things that can give us just the general pieces of information would be very helpful. The other thing that we found very interesting, and again, I was just so pleasantly surprised, was the collaboration with vendors that use or compile data for files. And it's not that they retain them for long periods of time, but there was enough data in some instances with some of the vendors that we work with that they were able to help provide solutions for recreating a lot of the data that needed to be recreated from the incident. So I think that's really key, is identifying partners that not only are going to help you in the moment, right, but that may be able to be a long-term solution if, God forbid, something ever did happen. They may be able to help in some capacity recreate, pieces of information that may be critical to the organization and just being able to move forward.
That's great to hear about the collaboration and all the help that people were able to get from other vendors and maybe even from some places that they didn't necessarily anticipate. I actually heard from someone in our company who were partnered with NextDeal, and they do store a lot of documents as part of their workflow, and that tool is used for a totally different purpose. But I was speaking to Rob, and he mentioned that a few CloudStar clients were able to reach out to him, and they were able to recover some of their because of the fact that they stored documents for them. So it's great to hear how so many people came together and were able to help out where maybe that's not even what their, service level agreement is, or that's not their main function, but they still saw an opportunity to help and they stepped in and did that. So that's really great to hear.
It's funny because NextDeal was one of the first ones that we thought of as well to help with that. And we recommended to our clients, let's reach out. For those that it was very helpful.
Can you talk a little bit about the steps of what happens during a recovery? And is there a difference between how you go about recovery from a disaster and crisis management between natural disaster and a cyber attack? What does that look like?
So, with a natural disaster, in most cases, you still have some sort of backup and redundancy that you can grab, right? Whereas with something like this, a cyber attack, depending on the hosting and or backup solutions that are in place and how they're set up, you may or may not have access to any of that data at all. And that can vary drastically depending on a number of variables, such as, are government officials involved and to what degree was the attack? I mean, there's a lot of different components that may prevent you from being able to get data, or you just may not have access to it. It may just be gone, which unfortunately was the case with many of our clients through this incident. And so what that has looked like is it's been very different for each client, actually, because in some cases, again, depending on how they structured their arrangement with their hosting provider, they were able to have backups because they had their own They maintained their own backups as well. And so in some cases, some clients were able to go back, even though it wasn't ideal. But like one client we have, they had to start with February, but thank God they had February, because then we're only looking at a few months. Another client that we had actually was only a month behind in a local backup. So theoretically, they were missing 1 month of, having to recreate data. And when I say missing, there's always still something somewhere, right? You've got emails, you've got paper files in some cases. Like there's always a trail somewhere. You've got Nextdeal, you've got, Close Simple, Alana, whatever the case may be. There's a trail somewhere. So if you're working with these other integration pieces, which we highly recommend, but for other clients, it was not so easy, and it has not been such a fun experience. We not that any of it was fun, but we have had to basically recreate things from anything from old tickets that we ourselves kept, where, for example, some of our clients will turn in tickets and say, hey, we need this workflow built out. Well, we had a lot of that information in our tickets. And so we were able to go back through tickets, go back through emails. We ourselves keep documentation for clients. And so we were able to rely on some of that. But that's the other thing when I mentioned earlier about, exporting some of this data. That would have been so helpful for us if once a month we had exported the workflows and just had them, because again, that would have been so helpful to say, well, here's everything we had up until last month, at least in a workflow processing piece, or here's all the documents that we have for you and the latest, greatest changes that were made, things of that nature. So in recreating these files, we've really learned to pay attention to what is kept and maintained. And again, I'm not necessarily saying anything from NPI perspective, but from an organizational perspective and an operational perspective, there are key things that you can be mindful of in maintaining and keeping record of.
So it sounds like it's important for title companies now to consider getting those redundancies in place. And so would you say that there's any sort of training that team members, that title companies need to be doing now in order to provide the best data management and also keep up with the huge amount of title order volume that they're seeing right now?
Yeah, I think one is internally really kind of rethinking where you're at today, because you have to. I mean, there's just no way around it. There's just new rules that we have to play by, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on how you look at it, because of technology. So, I think one is look to your team and say, how are we keeping up with this stuff? Are we keeping up with this? Because a lot of people don't even know if they are. You get, like I said, so focused on the day-to-day, no one really pauses to look at the big picture. So I think communicating internally and looking to your team members and saying, where are we, like with the different divisions and departments? How are we maintaining data? Are we maintaining data? I also think it's really critical to make sure that everyone understands the significance and usage of things like emails and encrypted messages and things of that nature, especially from a best practices for security, right? Because there are so many tools out there right now that, frankly, it's hard to tell if someone is, phishing, if it's a legitimate thing, because they have logos, they have actual wire instructions, they have phone numbers, they have even pictures. So, it's very important, I think, to be educated internally and make sure that everyone understands the significance of using whatever tools are available to you to protect and safeguard that data. Making sure that everyone knows the kinds of information that they should be sending out versus not sending out is also very critical. I mean, we've been talking for years about NPI and keeping things confidential and private, but do people really understand what that means? Making sure everyone understands the phishing scams and what those kinds of emails look like and what the protocol is if they do receive one, because a lot of times end users just think, oh, I have this and I'm just going to delete it. Well, usually IT wants to be notified. There are things that they can do to try to trace the resources and things of that nature. So you want to make sure that you have in place some kind of protocol for when these kinds of things happen. And then I always recommend periodic reviews and discussions taking place not only as reminders for staff, but also, again, to evaluate where are we today? How are we handling, say, for example, our document inventory repository? Does everybody know what documents we even have and use in case, God forbid, we should lose them? Where is that being stored? What about our workflows? Do we have proper documentation for our workflows? And then, of course, your consumer information, right? How are we protecting and safeguarding that? So I think it needs to be more communication and more training internally and educating everyone as to not only how you operate and what your protocols are, but also what you should and could be doing to protect the information of others.
So your team, your consulting firm also helps train staff on title production software. So can you go a little bit more into what that looks like? And do you see any areas where companies are underutilizing their software tools?
Oh my gosh, every day. Every day. Yeah, so we do train and we train on the production platforms, and we take more of a holistic approach. So we don't just train on the functionality of the software, but we really kind of go granular in most cases and say, this is how your company is going to use that software. So to use, we'll just say, Nextdeal, for example. I mean, every title company can use it, but some people might use it differently than others. And so really understanding what is our goal and how are we going to leverage this new tool that we have? What are we going to do to shine by using this tool? And so when we do our trainings, we try to really gear it toward what is specific to that specific client. And when it relates to security, of course, again, it's how are we going to be sending information securely? How are we making sure? Because a lot of these platforms, you can send documents, but are you making sure they're encrypted, or are you making sure they're PDFs and not Word documents that someone, can alter? So there's things like that we, take into consideration. And then most people really don't even think about that most of the platforms have some type of feature is banning unauthorized transactions or parties. Some people used to call it the block list, right? So you should not do business with this buyer. You should not do business with this attorney. You should not do business with this property, for example, because there's liens against it or something like that. Most of the platforms have something built in, and most people aren't even aware of it. So there are things like that, a lot of features that people just aren't aware of that are built into the platforms that not only can make your job easier, but they can also prevent long-term problems such as claims coming in. When we're doing the trainings, we try to make sure that we focus on, again, what's applicable to your company, and then, of course, maximizing the functionality within the platform.
And I'm sure when a company updates their software, they probably have a lot of high expectations about it solving a lot of their problems. But sometimes those problems might be organizational. They might be a lack of having the right best practices in place, or just overhauling of their internal processes. So the results can sometimes fall flat. Do you ever see that kind of thing happen? And then what are some tips that you give to clients to ensure their business tools align with their needs and expectations?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a loaded one too, because, it's a catch-22. You oftentimes need an upgrade in order to, as you said, fix things or to take advantage of the latest technology pieces. But at the same time, it's inevitable. It doesn't matter if it's Microsoft or if it's XYZ company, you're going to have a situation where, there's going to be what we call bugs or, issues that arise. So the first thing is we always recommend that whenever possible, clients remain at least one or two versions behind on upgrades, because the probability of new issues is decreased if they kind of vet it through, if you will, right? Because usually other companies have kind of gone through and beta and worked out as many kinks as possible. And the effects of this can vary drastically based on the client's setup. So for example, if you have client A that's using a whole bunch of integrations and client B who's using 2 integrations, and the upgrade comes out, they may or may not be affected in the same ways. The person who's got the integrations, maybe there's some bugs in the production platform that are going to cause issues with the integrations. But client B over here, they're never going to know it because they're not using those integrations. So we always recommend that they wait at least 1 or 2 versions behind. And then for us, we usually offer 2 options. We say, okay, clients, we are either going to go through this with you. We can go through the whitelist papers and or the list of identified issues with you and see which ones are going to pertain to you, or do our best to try to see which ones will pertain to them. Or we can go through this list for you first and then advise you as to which ones we think will affect you, and then make recommendations for which ones that they should be focused on. So that's one component. And then the other thing is that I wish I saw more of. Seems like usually it's more of the larger companies that take this approach, and I really wish smaller ones would as well. But we always advise whenever possible that clients install upgrades on like a test environment or a training environment first. So that way, whatever you can find, you're not in live production database. So we recommend that they review the release notes, identify the known issues, and then test in like a test environment. That way they can identify items that maybe are deal breakers for them and they haven't interrupted their production system. We also typically suggest that when they're trying to identify these, like when a rollout comes out and we say, you're going through the features, we ask them to try and identify people internally, such as like the subject matter experts of any division, to go through that process with them, because they're going to have information as to what would impact their workflows and their internal policies and procedures. They're going to know, well, if we implement this feature, that means that Susie Q is going to have 5 other steps that she didn't used to have before. Or what that means is it's going to eliminate completely this entire position that we have, because we now have this integration that's going to take care of this piece for us. So it's really important to have the involvement of staff who are doing the day-to-day production events and operations, to make them aware so that they can help build into new policies and procedures. And then lastly, of course, once you're ready and you've decided to go forward, we recommend that they educate the staff on the item so that everyone's aware, because all too often we see these wonderful upgrades and then we go on site with these clients or we connect with them and half of the staff is like, oh gosh, we didn't even know that was available. And this whole time I've been typing, 17 other pages or, whatever the case may be, when there was a shortcut this whole time that they just never knew about because it wasn't announced or it wasn't highly focused on in the organization. So education is critical in these upgrades and rollout. And in many cases, we actually do webinars and or shadow sessions to show these features, to point them out so that people actually see them. So those are our primary recommendations when we talk about upgrades.
Yeah, that sounds really great and thorough. And I know even from our side of things as vendors providing title support solutions, we've definitely heard some feedback about issues with integrations or some of our clients not wanting to update because they're afraid of losing certain features that they currently have or them not functioning quite right, and fixing those bugs can be a bit of an issue for some of them.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes you don't have a choice. I mean, that happens too. But when you can, those would be the precautionary steps we would recommend.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on the workforce shortage that we're facing in the title industry. And do you have any tips on when title companies should use temporary staffing or outsourcing title support services, like with PropLogix? What are your thoughts on that?
So our temporary staff augmentation solution is actually called the A-Team. And the A-Team was devised for any time and any situation, not just based on things going on now. So my recommendations really would be the same no matter what, whether it's now or when business as usual. If you're short-staffed and you need help, you should utilize the resources available to you. And oftentimes that does mean reaching out to your vendors. Sometimes that may mean your underwriters. Sometimes that may mean your partners, like your integration partners, such as you guys, because you never know who might have something that can help. So always reach out is my first thing. For specifically the staff augmentation, what we saw is, especially in our industry, it's not something that people go to school for, right? So trying to find people who understand what we do and know how to be able to jump in and do it, it can be challenging. So times to utilize this is when someone's out on a holiday or maternity leave, or, you know, they're on their honeymoon. If you have an influx of orders and you don't want to staff up just to turn right around and have to lay people off. If there's a heavy month end where your volume's high and you still, you know, you want to be able to sustain your current staff, right? We don't want to burn everybody out to the point that they just can't function. There's projects that you get behind on because other things take precedence, such as policies is a really big one. And then just temporary projects in general. You know, sometimes you have a building project that may come in. And again, it's one of those situations where you don't want to have to bulk up on staff only to have to turn around and lay them off next year. So I think those are examples that carry through certainly anytime, whether we're in the middle of, you know, what we're going through now or just in general. I think you just need to be aware that you have resources, number one, and reach out to them and ask them if you're feeling that kind of pressure for any one of those reasons.
Looking back on your time as an escrow officer, what training methods worked best for you in your early days? You know, we talk a lot about recruiting, but then the other side of that coin is the training. So, you know, like you said, there's no school really to train title professionals. So what are some tips that you would give to people in the industry who feel overwhelmed, who are dealing with the day-to-day, but still need to train people and need good methods for making those educational moments last and easy for new people to act on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I myself I've always been a hands-on person. So for me, actual experience has been my best teacher. You know, that said, I had amazing mentors who could see that I genuinely sought to learn and understand as much as possible in order to do the best job I could do and to be a valuable asset. So they really made sure to involve me in things like conference calls, client meetings, shadowing sessions, even closings. And they always made themselves available for me to ask questions and run things by them. So again, just a strong support system is really helpful. There was certainly a lot of learning by trial by fire as well, which does definitely teach you a lot. But when I made mistakes, I quickly learned from them and how to avoid them going forward. So for me, practical experience was the best teacher. But I do think that we can focus on things a little differently. We need to focus on forward-thinking technology as things advance. And I also think we need to make ourselves more known. So social media is one outlet to capture attention of people, but there are still things like job fairs and colleges and internships and things like that, career building assistance. So in fact, I can tell you, we ourselves, we have posted at several colleges for multiple positions in our company because no matter what, people do still find an interest in being a part of something. And in many cases, they just aren't sure what that should be or what that could even look like. So I think our industry needs to be more open to flexible working conditions and educating people that we're out there, right? And also, you know, we're kind of old school in some cases, and not every position needs to be in-house. It can be handled remotely, which we're starting to see more and more, and we've seen that over the last couple of years. I also think we need to consider how our offices are structured and how we can collaborate more internally. So one of the things that we always recommend to our clients is that they do cross-training. So regardless of the position being filled, it doesn't matter if you're the receptionist or frankly, you're the CTO. In my opinion, you should sit in every seat and see how this thing functions, right? You need to see what is the left hand doing and the right hand doing. How are we all connected? Everyone should have an idea of what goes on in an organization, and you should see how one department affects another, especially when it comes to title and escrow. And for so long, I feel that there was almost a division between the two, right? Title had their opinions and escrow had their opinions. And in many cases, they almost became adversarial, whereas you can't do one without the other. We're a team. And not only are we a team, when someone closes on their home, it takes both sides. So we implement that ourselves. And in fact, some of our strongest employees started off as back office assistants, and now they're managing teams. I just think it's really, really important that cross-training take place. I think you need to see what goes into every role if you can. And I'm not saying, months at a time in each division, but I do think that needs to take place initially when people are hired. I think that would make a huge difference. And I think it would make a difference in educating people on their specific role. How does it affect other people in the organization? And how do other people affect their role? I also think it's really important for people to feel like they're actually contributing to something and that they see there's room for them to grow and evolve. So it's really up to our industry to provide those kinds of opportunities. And in many cases, that's going to mean changing the way we think and the way we currently operate. I know I've had to adapt in many ways, and I'm still doing so in order to expand and for us to be the premier consulting firm in our industry. I think it's a continuous process because I've mentioned this. In fact, I mentioned it to Rob one time. You mentioned Rob. I did a podcast with him and I said, listen, in this industry, you're either growing or you're going. And that's where we are today. So we've got to be able to provide the opportunities in a way that makes sense. And I think we need to look more at a holistic approach where there's this cross-training involved and hands-on applications involved, because I think people need to see it and do it in order for it to really connect and sink in.
Is there anything else that you want to share before we end today's conversation?
I think I would just reiterate out of all of this, especially since you asked me to be on this, and I'm very grateful and appreciative of this opportunity. I would say the loudest message that I want to communicate is work with your vendors. Really, it's really important. I think people take for granted these integration relationships, and they really are critical for more than one reason, not just the day-to-day inner workings of closing a file. I mean, long-term, these relationships have a strong impact on our industry and on any organization. And I think the other thing is just really, make sure you're educated on what you're doing when it comes to security and the levels of protection that you're providing and that you're being asked to provide.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you very much, and I look forward to the next one.
Thanks again to Stephanie for joining me today. If you'd like to learn more about Streamline Consulting, you can head over to their website at streamline.rocks. Title Talks is produced by PropLogix and myself. Original music is by Cole Sando, and original graphics are by Jordan Norris. Until next time, happy closings.